you can go ahead and do that. Okay, so just a reminder, having two jobs is not healthy for you, and multitasking is not healthy for you. So try to put away the beeps, buzzers, and bells and give yourself 10 minutes to immerse yourself in some well-being. Last week, Carolyn did a great job introducing role modeling, and she used self-care as an example of role modeling. This week, we're going to introduce norms. Norms is one of the 6 building blocks that are needed to create a well-being culture on your team and in our workplace in general. I'm hoping to remind myself to get back to this idea of role modeling self-care as a norm, and you'll see what I mean as we get through these next 8 minutes or 9 minutes. So when I first put this together, the first thing that ran into my mind when I was thinking about norms was Norm Peterson from the TV sitcom Cheers. And so if any of you remember that show from the early 80s into the early 90s, would love to see some emojis out there lighting up. And for those of you who aren't familiar with this, apologies for my nostalgia. But what I really liked about Norm, not just that he was a smiling guy, was that when Norm would walk into the bar, everybody would go, Norm, which was a really fun way for him to come into the scene. And again, I'm going to hope to get back to Norm Peterson in a minute. What are norms? When most people make New Year's resolutions, they usually only last for a few weeks, maybe till the end of February. And often the reason why people aren't able to achieve their New Year's resolutions is because they are surrounded by people who have different behaviors than them. And so if I'm the person trying to exercise in my family and everybody else is sitting on the sofa and I don't have anyone to go do that with me, it's not the norm, it could be difficult. So norms are the behavior that's expected of a group. It's the behavior that's most common. It's a reflex. It's what's become a common practice. So in our health system, most people, if you're seeing a patient, the norm is to wash your hands before you go in. And when you're done seeing the patient, the norm is to wash your hands afterward. And, getting hand washing in clinical care centers took a long time, years. Whereas when the pandemic set in, there were other norms that adopted more quickly, like wearing a mask, whether or not you're seeing a patient. That's a norm that happened very quickly. Standing 6 feet apart, that also came on very quickly. When Norm walks into the Cheers bar and everyone yells out, Norm, that is a norm. So some norms might be across the entire organization and some might be specific to your team. If you think about our country, vaccines are the norm in Maryland, but they may not be the norm in Florida. So it could be regional. But some norms are across the entire country, like football. I mean, that's pretty generally accepted America pastime sport. And watching and rooting for a team is a norm. So how do we create norms or support norms on our team? And these are some things to think about. There's no one answer. These are some things to consider if you would like to create some healthy norms or some norms that support well-being on your team. So first, before you just jump into a conversation with your team, think about what possible norms you might propose. And so certainly it could be something that you've heard on your team, something that you've heard people talking about that they're working on for their own life. It could be things that you're observing. If you're observing that people on your team are sending emails hours after the normal shift has ended, then maybe one of the norms you might propose to your team is that you have some more work-life balance, and that means limiting the email hours. You Also want to consider what's going to be meaningful to yourself, because you really want to be able to, as a manager, as a leader, you really want to be able to put yourself behind whichever norm your team might decide to work on together. If your heart's not in it, it's going to be tough for the other people on the team to have their heart in it as well. And so maybe you do some thinking before this conversation comes about. And maybe at some point you'll need to involve your team, right? Nobody likes to be told what to do, especially when it's about their own health and well-being. And you certainly want everybody to participate in a conversation like this. And some of you might feel like, whoa, I'm a little bit uncomfortable raising this issue. Well, there's different ways to do that without, no one's going to be forced to share their own personal health issues or their personal health journey. It could just be, hey, I'm observing some stress on the team, or I've been noticing emails at night, or I'm noticing people aren't taking a break. And we need to talk about self-care because see Carolyn's session from last week and one coming up. You also want to consider who on the team, whose opinion carries a little bit more weight, because maybe you want to just kind of leverage their influence. It can be tricky. We've all experienced someone on the team who's a little bit more vocal, who's a little bit more influential on the team opinion, but take a few minutes to think about that before you dive into a conversation like this so you can set yourself up for success. 3 more tips on how you might go about doing this. You need to be a role model. This is kind of related to the first tip, which is, choose something that you think you can have your heart in, and because you want to be a role model. Now, we're all human. If you slip up, it's not the worst thing in the world, and you might want to acknowledge it. You might want to own it. Depending on what norm you're working on, you may want to not bring it to the attention of other people on your team. You'll have to figure that out. You don't want to make a joke out of it, though. You don't want to belittle it, because maybe somebody else on the team who's trying to reach this norm is struggling the same way, had the same slip up, and for them, it's like more devastating. And we don't want to make light, we don't want to accidentally make fun of somebody else's struggles. Identify resources. We have lots of resources here within Johns Hopkins Medicine. I'm sure you all have your favorite resources outside of Johns Hopkins Medicine, but as the team leader, when your team decides on a norm, make sure that you or a delegate on your team is looking for resources to make it easier for your team to achieve these goals, and identify obstacles. If there's a clear obstacle to whatever norm you choose, try to figure out how to get rid of that obstacle. So yes, I'm rushing because we're trying to stay in 10 minutes. Today's tips, agenda tip number 7. Last 6 were in the previous weeks. Talk with your team. Prepare to have this conversation. Data bears out that almost everybody would like to improve their health and well-being in some way or another. And so if you're not hearing it, I'm sure they're thinking it. And having you as the team leader bring it up is going to make them feel like you care. Manager tip number 11. You have your own health and well-being goals, and think about what's interfering with them. Are there people that you're living with, or people that you work with, or are you involved with a community program, a religious institution, whatever cultures that you're involved with? Are there norms that are keeping you from getting to your goals? And try to figure out what, if anything, you'd like to do about that to protect your own well-being and improve your health. So we have, as usual, 2 questions before you go. If you don't mind, Meg will put these in the chat box. Next week, Carolyn is coming back, and she's going to continue on this norm thing, and she's going to look at rest and taking a break. 2 great examples of self-care. So we hope you'll join us for that. As always, we want to support you. We're going to take questions and answers in a minute, but we have contact information up here. And Meg, I think you're going to put the slides in from today's presentation into the chat box as well. That's great. And that is 10 minutes. Boom.